Ronald Dalton's wife died accidentally. A pathologist disagreed, and Dalton was convicted of murder. He served 8.5 years waiting for his appeal, then another trial that set him free. The Ron Dalton story is a veritable family saga of lives transformed by the untimely death of a young woman and how the justice system responded. And yet, it all began, innocently enough, on a farm in Prince Edward Island, where although far from the lure of the city, it did not take long before Ron began to dream about a life beyond the potato fields around him.
Growing up on the farm, you see the 100 acres that you're living on, but you don't see much of the world beyond. But as you get a little older and you learn more about the world, you want to be part of a bigger world.
Ronnie's my oldest boy. He was always very smart, and he knew what he wanted.
Certainly Ron was very determined to succeed, to achieve in his life.
In 1973, my family moved to Miscarriage, and it was then a high school. This is the high school that I attended. And that's where I met my wife, Brenda.
You knew they were going to get married and have their children and have their life, and it was destined to be that way for them. And off they went and did it.
This is the church where Brenda and I were married. I married the same year I graduated university. We had our first son a couple years later and a daughter a couple years after that. I was working for a bank. I had come a fair distance and we were quite pleased.
By the age of 32, most of Ron Dalton's childhood dreams had materialized. By then, he and his growing family were living in Gander, Newfoundland.
In 1988, Gander was a small town, probably 10 or 12,000 people. I think there were 4 banks in town. I was managing one of them. We had a fairly prominent position in town. We had 3 children. Our oldest son was 9. We had a 6-year-old daughter, and we had another son who was only 18 months old. We had a house and a new car, and Brenda was home with the children. I was working. I was at the top of my game, I suppose.
Yet destiny is often blind to achievement. And on one particular day in August, fate lay coiled to strike a blow that would shatter the Daltons' lives forever.
August 15th, 1988 was a Monday. Our anniversary was coming up later in the week. On August 20th, we would have been married 11 years. So I had an anniversary card hidden in the car someplace for my wife. My day at the bank went fairly long that evening. By the time I got home, it was probably 7:30 or 8 o'clock, and the baby was in bed by then. But the oldest 2 children, they were still up waiting to see if I got home before they had to go to bed.
While the couple enjoyed the company of their 2 older children that night, they had no idea that this was to be the last time they would do so together, nor that this would turn out to be the last day the children would see their mother alive.
We checked on them, and then Brenda and I had a bit of time to ourselves now. She had saved, we were watching some TV. She had a small little dessert-size glass bowl of dry granola cereal. She was kind of munching on that. But all of a sudden she gave a little cough, and I thought maybe she had something stuck in her throat. I reached over and gave her a little pat on the back and just kind of waved my hand away. So I wasn't particularly concerned, but I left the room we were in and got her a little glass of water. When I came back, she was on her knees in front of this love seat, and she was beet red in the face, so I became concerned when I saw her. She seemed to be in distress. I tried to get her to take a drink, but, as I was trying to calm her down a bit, she lost consciousness. She regained consciousness then briefly, and lost consciousness a second time. I looked in her mouth to see if I could see anything, an obstruction blocking her breathing or anything. I tried to get her to breathe, wasn't able to do that, so I reached to the television, had a telephone on top of it, and a telephone book. There was no 911 service in Gander, So I had to look up the number of the local hospital. I called the switchboard there and they put me onto the emergency department.
Unknown to Ron, what he told the hospital emergency department would be brought to the attention of the police.
I told them that my wife wasn't breathing, that I couldn't get her to breathe, to send an ambulance right away. And I immediately went back to Brenda, tried to get her to breathe. I did that for 4 or 5 or 6 minutes, however long it took the ambulance to arrive. They told me that they had a pulse, which I took as a good sign, of course. About the time we were getting her aboard the ambulance, a police officer pulled up, and I didn't know at the time, but apparently the emergency department, when they dispatched the ambulance, also notified the police that there was somebody found unconscious at home. The police officer came in and asked if there was anything she could do. And I asked her to go across the street and ask my neighbor if he would come over and stay with the children. I went back into the house and checked on the 3 children, and I was in the driveway in my vehicle getting ready to follow the ambulance when the police officer told me that my neighbor had agreed to come over and that she would stay there until the neighbor came by.
By the time Ron arrived at the hospital, he was in a daze.
They directed me to a seat maybe 10 feet away from the actual emergency room itself, and I sat there for the next hour and a quarter, which was probably the longest hour and a quarter of my life. You're in the middle of a hurricane and there's no stopping it, like you're not in control of the situation. For me, that was one of the big things. I was the bank manager, I could get things done. When Brenda began to choke, in my mind someplace I thought that's a simple obstruction. You remove the obstruction and the person breathes. Well, it's not that simple. This was a situation where I had no control. Some people who observed me at that time had observed me as being very distraught and crying and running my fingers through my hair, and others said there was almost a startled response. As soon as someone came by, you were hyper vigilant and very attentive. The police officer who attended at the house that night also came down to the hospital. You're being talked about in the third party. I can still picture the minute by minute and who was coming and going, and of course the longer the procedure took, the more concerned I become. About a half hour into this treatment, one of the nurses did stop and say that they were trying to restart her heart, I think is the way they put it, which didn't sound very positive to me. And then 10, 15, 20, 25 minutes after that, some rational part of me was kind of figuring out that if her heart wasn't beating and nobody was telling me that it had started again, that it probably wasn't good news. They pronounced her dead about 1:15 and informed me shortly thereafter, and it was somewhat anticlimactic. I was almost expecting what they were going to say. Our own family physician happened to be there that night and offered to take me in to see her, and he warned me, of course, that she would be, I think the way he put it was a bit of a mess from having been worked on. You know, there would be gauze and tapings, and they just had a sheet over her, and some of her clothing had been cut away, and she had been intubated, so there'd be a tube down into her throat that had been left in place. You know, they would just leave all that stuff there pending an autopsy and stuff. He said it's automatic in cases like this where a young woman dies outside the hospital setting, unless they've been, under a doctor's care for cancer or some other terminal illness, that an autopsy would automatically be performed.
Less than 3 hours after Ron and Brenda had sat down to watch TV in their den, Ron would return home a widower, wondering how he would tell the children.
The youngest was only 18 months old. He wasn't going to understand anything. I couldn't make sense of it myself.
And it was a quiet, uneventful night for me. In the morning, Dad came up and told me still while I was in bed that Mom had died that night.
I think we just went to bed that night and woke up and our whole world was different.
She's gone.
And I can recall kneeling by her bedside. The 3 of us were crying and looking up, and the neighbor and the baby are standing in the doorway.
The unfortunate happening occurred when I was 1.5 years old. So I have virtually no memory of my mother.
So I waited till about 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and I called Brenda's parents first. They were devastated, of course. Nobody expects to bury their children. I called my mother and informed her.
It was just unbelievably unreal. Like, how could this happen?
Mom called my husband at work so he would come home. We just couldn't believe that she was gone.
Within the hour, we were on a plane on our way to Newfoundland.
The following morning, you're trying to make funeral arrangements for somebody that was sitting next to you on the couch watching TV 8 or 10 hours earlier. You go into a room full of boxes and you pick one that you think is appropriate. We knew that we'd be bringing Brenda back to Prince Edward Island, where all of our families were, and where we had been married and the children had been baptized and we grew up. That's where we'd be bringing her back to bury her. It's all a bit unreal.
The situation would only become more surreal for the grieving family once Ron returned from the funeral home and the police arrived at his door.
They basically came in and said, we want you to leave your house. This was the scene where a young woman, otherwise healthy, with no known medical conditions, had expired, I think is the way they put it, but they wanted to secure the scene while they were awaiting the results of the autopsy. And I didn't see what it accomplished to come in 12, 14, 15 hours later. The neighbor who had come over and babysitting the children while I was at the hospital had tidied up the room a bit. People had come in and taken out garbage and vacuumed during the day, They were fairly forceful on this, and it was all very bizarre, but we were just the same asked to leave the house. We walked across the street to my neighbor's house, and by the time my mother and sister arrived, there was a police officer guarding the door and informed them that I was across the street and they could go there too.
We couldn't come in and we couldn't bring our suitcases in, and the kids were out on the street. It was just crazy.
The next 7.5 hours or so, that situation remained much the same.
What Ron and his family did not know is that the autopsy on Brenda's body would only be performed that evening, and by the time it was completed, the pathologist had come to a shocking conclusion.
By 11:30, 3 or 4 police cars come back to the house. My sister immediately goes over, figures something must be up, and she's told that they would like to see me. So she comes back across the street. So we're thinking, good, we finally got the results now. Her and my mother and myself crossed the street. We missed a chance for a viewing in Gander. We'll still carry on in the morning. Our flights were in the morning and Brenda was going to follow us, and the rest of the arrangements would still work. And as we're getting towards the front door, they step out and say, no, they want to see him down at the detachment. Seems kind of odd.
Didn't make sense to me. It was not normal. Nothing was normal that day, but this was even more out of the norm.
My sister drives us over to the local RCMP detachment, and we get about 2 feet inside the door. They usher me into a side room and say, we'll drop him off when we're finished. You can leave now.
They took him and would not let me see him, speak to him.
I'm thinking I'm there to learn the autopsy results, and they'd just like to recount the events one more time. They start taking a narrative statement, they want to know the time you get up in the morning, what you had for breakfast, and go through the day sort of thing.
Outside the interrogation room, his sister Linda was worried.
I called a lawyer from the police station, and the lawyer called the police for me and said, no, everything's fine. And I thought, oh my God, am I overreacting?
Reassured, Linda went home. Meanwhile, her brother was wearing down.
We go till 2:15 or so. Well, what about the autopsy results? Well, there's still a few more tests we're just waiting on to complete. 24 hours now since my wife has died.
Ronald Dalton had no idea that the pathologist's conclusion was that his wife had been strangled. As the night dragged on, he requested a lawyer.
The response was that if you're guilty of doing something, a lawyer can't help you. And if you're not, then you don't need a lawyer. And I'm thinking to myself, there wouldn't be any lawyers in that case, That kind of response was shutting me down. Of course, then the tone would become more accusatory, You've murdered your wife, you killed her, how could you do that to the mother of your children? You'll be an outcast, nobody will speak to you, you'll be run out of the community. They kept me there trying to speak to me from 2:15 till 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning when they made the decision to arrest me. And then I was permitted for the first time to make a phone call. And
At 5:30 in the morning, I knew that I was right. There was something wrong, really, really wrong. And Ron called and asked me to see a lawyer. I went down to the police station and banged on the door. One fellow did come out, and he just said they were arresting him for murder.
He's under arrest.
Ronald Dalton's wife, Brenda, had unexpectedly died the night before. During the course of the next day, his family was forced to leave their home as the site became a crime scene. Late that night, the police wanted to question Ron. By the very next morning, he was under arrest for his wife's murder.
they took all of my clothes and searched my body and see if there's any defensive wounds or claw marks or wherever they were looking for. They did all those nice indignity things. Gave you a paper jumpsuit and a pair of somebody else's woolen socks that came up to your knees, no shoes or anything, put you in a squad car and take you from the detachment to the subdivision, where another group is going to interrogate you throughout the day.
In the meantime, Linda had to take charge of her brother's children.
At one point, a police officer escorted us to our house where we could get our personal belongings, and that was the last time we were in our house.
I put them on the plane with Mom and sent them home so that they just wouldn't be there. I stayed and chased Ron around all day, basically. But every place I went, they had a little chat with me, like, ask him this and tell him to take a lie detector test. I was naive, but I didn't believe what they were telling me. The next day, he was in court being arraigned with his jumpsuit on and wool socks, and it was, I can still see him coming out there and it was terrible.
It was certainly devastating for me to be accused of murder, be accused of harming my wife. They actually read out a more formal information sheet they have that you did willfully breach section 215 or whatever it is of the Canadian Criminal Code, to wit, committing murder on the person of Mary Brenda Dalton, or however the wording is. There is a formal wording.
And they just whipped him off, and that was it. And I had to come home to the funeral.
My wife is home, having a wake and a funeral and being buried. I never got to attend that.
In the midst of their grief, the family also had to come to terms with Ron having been charged with murdering his wife.
It was hard to get into my head because I thought, who are they talking about? That's not Ronnie they're talking about. Brenda and Ronnie always got along, and there was never any question of them having any kind of violence in their family, and we never had it in our family.
It was fairly inconceivable to think that Dad would have actually killed Mom. It didn't make any sense to me. At some level, it was overwhelming, and emotional detachment is something that I've turned to at times. It's just been better to take a step back from your emotions and handle things on an intellectual level, and that's probably the first example I'd have seen that in my life.
Despite the fact the Crown argued Mr. Dalton was a flight risk, after all, as a banker he might have stashed away a load of cash, Ron Dalton won bail and came home to Prince Edward Island pending trial.
All the money we could raise between myself and my parents and my sister and was put up as cash bail.
Everything we had was sitting in the courthouse in Newfoundland.
I moved in with my sister, brother-in-law, and their 3 children, and my 3 children in a 3-bedroom house.
We knew we'd have to go through this year, and the trial would be over, and then we could get back to our lives, without Brenda. But we knew that they would do the right thing. I mean, justice would prevail.
What I did do in terms of trial preparation is when our children were put to bed, 8 or 9 o'clock, I would go down to my sister's basement and I would spend 2 or 3 hours writing. I wrote 162 pages or 164 pages or something. I think it finally It turned out to be over a 2-week period. I sent it to my lawyer. I said, here's the background, here's what I can remember about the night that Brenda died, whatever information I thought might be helpful.
In his document, Ron revealed that he had not been fully accurate in his police statement because he had something to hide.
Earlier that same year, I had briefly carried on an affair with an ex-employee of the bank. We both yielded to a temptation, and we saw each other half a dozen times over that next couple of weeks, between mid-June and the end of June. But that would be 2 months before my wife died.
Ron wrote that he never had any intention of leaving his wife, but by then, back in Gander, the police had also learned of the affair. This new information convinced them more than ever that he was guilty, and the investigation intensified to include phone tapping and other methods.
On 3 separate occasions, the police got a surveillance van and put microphones at my wife's gravesite and sat here for 2 or 3 days in the hopes that I would come and confess to a gravestone, I guess. On Mother's Day, on the anniversary of her death, and I think on her birthday, I think were the 3 occasions that they used.
One of the unfortunate consequences of police tactics was that Brenda's parents were becoming increasingly estranged.
When it first happened, they were very supportive of Ronnie. They were willing to put up their house, and they were great. And then the police got involved.
They would be meeting with them, and they would bring autopsy pictures to show to them, for example. Part of the autopsy process is they reflect your scalp, which is a fancy way for saying they cut it back here and they peel it back over your face to look below it for bruising or anything like that. But there's pictures like that they present to this older couple. They were in their 60s at the time, this older couple, knowing that's their daughter, and then saying, now this is what that monster did to your daughter.
Even with his in-laws' trust eroding, Ron had to focus on the battle ahead for the sake of the children. They had already lost their mother. Now they were at risk of losing their father too.
In March of '89, a preliminary inquiry was held for 7 days in Gander. We learned then that the Crown was alleging that Brenda had been manually strangled. We received a copy of the autopsy report. The 2 pillars that the case rested on were the affair and strangulation. The affair we knew was true. We couldn't change that, but the main thing for us was convincing the jury that no crime had been committed, because we knew none had been committed.
14 months after Brenda Dalton had died unexpectedly, her husband would stand trial for her murder.
Mine was the first murder trial ever in Gander. So it's very sensational, you know, the local bank manager kills his wife. I was on bail, so I was free to come and go. I would get in the prisoner's box, and just before the jury was called in, they would bring in RCMP officers. It's the prisoner in the prisoner's box being guarded by the armed guards that leaves a perception with 12 people off of the street who've been asked to judge a case. It's a constructed piece of theater, certainly, and the Crown take maximum advantage of that. The judge is on a raised dais, of course, looking down on all of you. My lawyer is sitting in front of me with his back to me, so there's no contact. You're in that position of being forcibly silent. If you speak, they'll have you removed altogether. All of these people come forward and reiterate some of what I had lived through and my life being dissected through their eyes. And of course, I'm there listening to this as a third party almost.
Ron Dalton would also testify about what happened the night that Brenda died.
Just happened the day after I arrived over there. They replayed Ronnie's statements and testimony and the questioning and all that stuff. And I heard all this and I thought, wow, that sounds so bad. because Ronnie didn't have the emotion. And I thought, if I was one of the jurors, I might even say, wow, that guy's cold.
Trying to judge someone's innocence or guilt based upon appearance of grieving is quite a stretch.
Well, Dad becomes a different person when he talks about it. He puts on a different persona. And I think he needs to talk about it, because it's just he doesn't do it emotionally, because I don't think he can.
But the core of the Crown's case against Ronald Dalton was the damning conclusion of the pathologist.
Took her by the neck and really choked her to death. And again,
I knew the pathologist was wrong. I knew Brenda had not been strangled.
To just sit there and have a professional forensic pathologist say that, yeah, you did it undoubtedly, it's got to be hard.
The pathologist who had conducted the autopsy is a good old Newfoundland fellow. He'll stop and he'll talk and he'll joke. He's a very good storyteller. He's a raconteur. Unfortunately, he's not a qualified forensic pathologist, but he played very well in front of the jury. We brought in a guy who had done thousands more autopsies, was board certified, knew his craft, but he's a Philadelphia pathologist. So the Crown basically said, who are you going to believe? The local doctor who did the autopsy, or the hired gun from Philadelphia who's getting paid big money to come in and say, our guy is wrong?
Still, perhaps the testimony that would seal Ron's fate in the minds of the jury was that of the last person who took the stand.
The last thing they wanted the jury to hear was that I had been carrying on an affair with this woman a couple months before my wife died. They didn't say they were offering this as evidence of motive, but they left that suggestion with the jury as they're going to debate my fate among them.
6.5 weeks after it began, the trial was at an end, and Ronald Dalton's fate lay in the hands of the jury. Would they believe his testimony about how Brenda had choked to death? Or would they believe the pathologist who said Ron had strangled her? Ronald Dalton's trial for allegedly strangling his wife was over, and now, after 2.5 days of deliberation, the jury's verdict was at hand. Only his mother and younger brother David could be there to support him.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty.
I can always hear the voice of the jury foreman. You feel like the bottom has dropped out of your stomach. You're hardly able to stand. I can hear my mother screeching in the back of the courtroom, so that's a very awful moment.
I had to leave the courtroom. I couldn't stay in there. I just about passed out.
The judge would impose a mandatory life sentence.
Whether you're anticipating it or not, it's probably a shock. I wasn't anticipating it. I was the one person in the room in the whole process that absolutely knew that Brenda was not strangled. I knew there had not been a murder. My family and my lawyer believed that, but I knew. The police immediately took me in custody. Before, I was only in custody while I was in the prisoner's box. But once the verdict came in, then I was a convicted murderer and I was in police custody for the rest of my life.
And we were allowed to have, I think, 5 minutes together. So we hugged and cried. And the last thing Ronnie said was, make sure the kids are okay. And I said, I'll be there for the kids. And then they took him away. David and I had to go back to the motel by ourselves. And while David went over to take Ronnie his clothes, I had to call Linda, because Linda was home waiting for the verdict. And I could hardly dial the telephone.
It was like he died too.
Years ago, I used to take Fiorinol for migraines, and I looked in my purse because I thought, I can't go back home without Ronnie. And I picked up some Fiorinol and I put them in my hands, and I said, maybe I won't have to go home. And then I looked and I thought, there's 6 kids home. I can't do this. They've lost their mother. They've lost their father, and I have to be there. So I threw them in the garbage. And then I thought, this is it, Mary. You have to be there for the children. And I said, no more of this foolishness. And I came home and tried to help Linda and Sonny as much as I could.
By 6 o'clock that evening, I was in the back of a police cruiser in the middle of a snowstorm, being driven 4 hours away to St. John's, to Her Majesty's Penitentiary. The next day, they'll process me, which just means taking all your belongings and throwing them in a paper bag and giving you some used underwear and some used clothes to wear while you're there. The enforced idleness is one of the first things that I noticed. I was used to working for a living, and it was difficult to have nothing to do all day and all day to put in doing nothing.
And then we had to tell the kids, no, Dad won't be home for Christmas.
I just wasn't there, and I wasn't going to be there for a while. My lawyer told me having been convicted of murder, it would be a waste of time and money to apply for bail, so we didn't even apply for bail.
2 days after Christmas, Ron Dalton's lawyer would file an appeal on his behalf, but Ron had no idea just how long he would have to wait to be heard.
The transition from one prison to another was made 6 weeks later or so, and that brought me into a federal institution, which are larger. You have people doing longer sentences. Although I had a white-collar background and no criminal record, and never been in a fist fight in my life, never mind having committed any acts of violence, and I was placed in a maximum security prison, of course, because I was a convicted murderer. Doing a life sentence, they know you're going to be around for a while, and they'll start you off in the maximum security and let you work your way, cascade down through the system if you play by the rules. And one of the rules is admitted to this crime you've committed, so I stayed in maximum security. Prison is not a place where everybody gathers every day and shares their emotions. You check those at the door for the most part. You're here in a maximum security joint, you're doing a life sentence. Nobody wants to hear your sad tale, quite frankly. They got one of their own, which may be all the sadder. They don't want you whining about how you don't belong here and you're innocent and you can't wait to go home. That'll get you in trouble. Nobody wants to hear you whining. The people in the next cell can't help you in the situation, but they can hurt you if you complain about it too much.
I was thinking something would happen to him when he was in prison, that he would be standing there and somebody would stab him, and, because that does happen. I worried about that a lot. And I also worried that I might die while he was in prison, and I wanted to be here when he got home. And I thought, don't let me die while he's there.
I had to survive in that environment, keeping a focus on the children and family I had outside of the prison, to give me something to cling to, and the certain knowledge that I had that I was innocent. I had the truth to keep me going.
And I always knew my father was in jail. I don't think I was ever actually told why. I'm not so sure the people around my age knew, especially in the younger ages, but I'm sure their parents knew, and they probably found out from them.
I always approached it as something that if somebody asked, I would tell them as much as I could. More often I found that the kids were afraid to ask the questions that they wanted to know. And it was better just volunteering the whole story, and then everybody was done, the curiosity is satisfied, and you move on.
One psychologist told us that what we were feeling, kids had that multiplied 1,000 times.
She was 4 graves in from the school playground. I knew growing up that she was dead. I didn't exactly know how she died, but I knew she was dead.
There was lots of times as a child where you just look at it and say, well, bad people go to jail, so Dad must have been bad and Dad must have done this.
Adam asked me what I thought. He said, Grammy, do you think Dad would do that? And I said, Adam, I'm not going to tell you what to think. I said, personally, I know in my heart that my son could not do that. We went to prison about once a month, and I had several overnight visits. We would go in there on a Friday night, and they would lock us in this trailer, and we could spend a couple of days with Ronnie.
We missed him being away, so getting over to see him, that was a treat, and it was like a vacation.
It was odd in that way that for the kids it was a bit of a trip until we got there, until we had to leave.
They would come and take him away, and we would see the guards walk him down the road and have to say goodbye and leave him there. And
it was a very solemn and silent drive home.
As time went by, the children growing up, Ron Dalton languished in jail as if forgotten by the justice system.
The money was gone, and so I think the total interest in the case was pretty well gone too.
I lost about 4 years, a year and a half waiting for the trial transcripts, and another 2.5 years waiting for my trial lawyer to do the appeal before he abandoned it, basically, and abandoned me in maximum security custody.
There was times where we thought maybe, year 5 or year 6, maybe the appeal already happened and he didn't want to tell us that, it failed.
Although Ron would get some legal aid assistance, it did not advance his cause.
7 years in, I filed my own appeal factum with the Court of Appeal. By this time, I'm a jailhouse lawyer now. I've read all the books in the jail. I wrote away to the Supreme Court to get the rules of court because they weren't in the prison for any of the Atlantic provinces. On a 10-year minimum sentence, I was eligible to apply for day parole after 7 years. My appeal still hadn't been heard after 7 years. So I filed my own factum with the court, and that's when all hell kind of broke loose. The court said, no, you're not qualified to do this. You should have a lawyer do this.
6 months later, someone in the law firm that had been representing him, which was now breaking up, recommended another lawyer.
I first spoke to Mr. Kennedy about 3 days later. He said, I'll look at this. He contacted me within a week. I said, I've made arrangements for you to be transferred back to St. John's to Her Majesty's Penitentiary so we can meet face to face. He managed within 6 weeks to prepare what the other lawyers had not done in 7.5 years.
1 year later, the appeal court judges were ready to rule.
The appeal court unanimously overturned my murder conviction, although they ordered a new trial. They said that there's clear evidence here that there may have been no crime, and that's something for a jury to decide. And then I was released on bail pending a second trial.
They brought him down the street with his handcuffs on, so I guess they were making their last statement in case they didn't get their hands on him again.
Ronald Dalton still had to stand trial a second time for the same charge of murdering his wife. And this time, he knew all too well that when facing a jury, no one can guarantee the outcome. After serving 8.5 years, Ronald Dalton finally won a second chance to prove his innocence. But in the interim, his children would have to wait once again before they got their father back.
While a trial was still pending and there was still that possibility of being yanked back out of their life, I didn't think it would be fair to go there for 7 or 8 or 10 months, whatever time period it was going to take for the next trial, and then be gone again.
We weren't saying, oh, well, this will be over, we'll start life again, and we certainly weren't like that. The kids stayed here under our custody.
Ron was far from his family, the legal system overshadowing every part of his life, when a new player entered the scene to support him.
I was back and forth to Mr. Kennedy's office on a pretty regular basis. On one occasion when I was there was a lady just leaving his office.
I came to be familiar with his story early in 1998, before he was actually released.
She introduced herself, and her son was being represented by Mr. Kennedy at the time. He was also facing a murder charge.
I guess we got close because he had such an understanding for what we were going through, and likewise, we came to understand all that he had been through.
By the time Ronald Dalton's trial began, he realized a lot had changed.
Mr. Kennedy applies to the judge that I not be referred to as the prisoner or as the accused, but I be referred to as Mr. Dalton. I not be seated in a prisoner's box, but I be seated next to him at counsel table. There are no armed guards in the courtroom. So some of those nuanced things that make an impact on the jury had changed by then. The same players all testified 10 years later. Beverly testified, but her evidence didn't seem to carry as much weight this time. We focused certainly on the fact that there was no crime. And if there's no crime, yes, this man had committed adultery, but we don't hand out life sentences in this country anymore for adultery. He's not on trial for adultery.
A psychologist testified about Ron Dalton's state of mind when his wife was choking and why he misled the police in his statement during interrogation. But the heart of the defense strategy was to discredit the conclusion of the pathologist.
We got 9 guys saying the original pathologist is wrong. That's our defense. It hasn't changed from the first trial, but the magnitude of our evidence has. All of these experts came in and testified. My wife died accidentally by choking on food. When somebody chokes, it's a complex mechanism, and you don't need something to block an airway. A feather or a piece of dust, if you get the right reaction, will cause your airway to close up on itself. And so we got an emergency room doctor testifying about some of the mistakes made in the emergency room that night.
The trial would last 9 months this time, and then once again, it was time for Ronald Dalton to face the verdict of a jury of his peers.
It was the 3rd day out, and Mr. Kennedy was, after the 2nd day, saying, you better prepare your family just in case. It's a jury, and there are no guarantees.
But even until the very last minute, I wouldn't even breathe thinking, please, please say innocent, because they could have said guilty again, and I don't know. It was just a tense time.
And on the 20th of June, on a Saturday, the 3rd day of deliberations, the jury came back and found me not guilty. So I felt elated, certainly. The family was ecstatic. The only family member who's not present is my daughter. She's graduating from high school that Monday. For me, that was always the snapshot of the 12 missing years. She had just graduated kindergarten when her mother died, and I just barely made her high school graduation.
It was the one time that I looked out and he was there. It was great to have him there.
I still had 30 days to wait to see if the Crown was going to appeal the acquittal. On the 29th day, the Crown announced that they would not, and for the first time in 12 years, I was free. Then I had to start to pick up the pieces of the rest of my life.
3 years after Ronald Dalton was acquitted, a public inquiry began in Newfoundland, examining how the justice system had failed 3 men whose murder convictions were overturned. By the time it was over 3 years later, the government apologized to Ronald Dalton for the court's inaction as he waited all those years for his appeal.
The apology from the government was important for Dad. It was something that shows recognition by the government that there was systematic problems wrong, which they had to address.
When you think of an apology for something like this, the way that I think of it anyway is you go and you cut somebody's arm off, and then you say, oh, I'm sorry for cutting your arm off. You know, it's nice to hear, it's nice to show people that you said, oh, I'm sorry, but at the end of the day, you still don't have an arm. He was a bank manager, living good life, wife, 3 kids, house, and in the blink of an eye, it was gone. And it's never going to be gotten back. It's gone.
Ronald Dalton would subsequently sue for compensation for his ordeal and win. Finally, he and his family were ready to start a new life.
We have to look ahead. We managed to get through. We were positive because we knew that he was innocent.
I loved my wife then. I love her memory now. I love her children and our grandchildren. I wish she was here to share some of this. There's a million things that I missed along the way, but I'll get some of those, and she's missed them all. One of the most painful after effects from all of this ordeal has been the breach between my wife's family and my own family. I don't think those rifts will ever be fully mended.
It'll never happen. But now that I'm older, I can see from both sides why it's okay now. It's okay that they can't.
I have learned that in my case, my demeanor was one of the things that the police seized upon. You know, they didn't think I was emotional enough. They didn't think I reacted appropriately at different times. And in reliving this experience so often in the last 20 years, because for most of that 20 years I've been involved in either criminal or civil proceedings where I've had to dissect this stuff minutely and go through all of the details over and over again, it becomes a little flat and unresponsive in the telling. And I think the danger is there for somebody watching this or hearing me speak about that to say that's a pretty cold guy, you know. He's talking about his wife's death pretty unemotionally. He had an affair, he went to prison, somebody else looked after the kids, but it all sounds pretty clinical, but nobody knows, of course, how you felt living through that. They don't feel the pain that you feel, or the pain that you feel watching your family suffer, all of the things that they had to endure because of that. Some people will still think that I got away with murder. I don't like that, but I know that's a fact. It's human nature that if I've been arrested and charged and once convicted, there will be people out there who simply will say he got away with murder. But I can't live my life worrying about what other people think. I have always known that I never harmed my wife.